The slap echoed louder than the sirens that surrounded the courthouse steps. Sharp, sudden, and soaked in a kind of arrogance that believed power could never be questioned. In that single moment, a decorated black woman standing silently among crowd was reduced, judged, and humiliated before anyone even knew who she truly was. Cameras captured the tension, the rigid posture of officers, and the cold assumption that authority belonged only to certain faces. What they did not realize was that the woman they dismissed, the woman they struck without hesitation, carried a history of discipline, sacrifice, and service far deeper than their ranks. And within hours, when she returned in full uniform, the same ground that once felt secure beneath their feet began to crumble under the weight of truth, accountability, and consequences they never saw coming. Before we continue, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Story for more powerful, true, inspired stories. On an early autumn morning, the city of Crestwood stood wrapped in its usual rhythm of routine order and quiet hierarchy. The courthouse plaza, a place where justice was supposed to be symbolized, had long been a stage for both fairness and silent prejudice. Officers often gathered there during public demonstrations, and the sight of uniforms became so common that citizens rarely questioned the dynamics of authority unfolding before them. Among the onlookers that day stood a woman named Amara Lewis, dressed in plain civilian clothing, her posture calm yet observant. She had returned to the city after months of federal training, choosing to move through the streets quietly rather than announce her presence. Years of service had taught her that understanding a system required witnessing it unfiltered. She had grown up in neighborhoods where sirens were more familiar than lullabies, where assumptions were made before introductions, and where dignity often had to be defended in silence. Amara's journey into law enforcement had never been about power. It had been about protection. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, she learned early that respect was rarely handed to black women in authority without resistance. Her academic excellence, her military discipline, and her record of outstanding service had carried her into a specialized federal unit focused on civil oversight and internal accountability. Yet she never wore her rank as armor in public spaces. She preferred to observe, to understand the environment without the immediate shift in behavior that uniforms demanded. That morning, the courthouse steps were surrounded by local officers conducting crowd control for a minor protest. The gathering itself was peaceful, but tension lingered in the air, subtle and familiar. Officers formed a visible barrier, scanning faces, categorizing individuals within seconds. Amara noticed the patterns immediately. She saw how some civilians were greeted with polite nods, while others were met with suspicion simply for standing still. She positioned herself near the outer edge of the plaza, watching carefully. Her instincts were sharp, honed through years of experience reading situations before they escalated. She observed how one particular group of officers carried themselves with excessive confidence, their body language signaling belief in unquestioned authority. Their movements were less about maintaining order and more about asserting dominance over the environment. The lead officer among them, known within the department for his aggressive enforcement style, had built a reputation that few openly challenged. His record showed commendations for efficiency, but also a pattern of complaints quietly buried beneath internal reviews. In many ways, he represented a culture that valued control over compassion and enforcement over fairness. As the crowd shifted slightly, Amara remained still, her eyes scanning the scene with professional awareness. She noticed how the officer's attention drifted toward her more frequently than others. It was not her behavior that drew their focus, but rather their assumptions shaped by her presence. A black woman standing calmly in a tense environment, composed and observant, was interpreted not as a citizen exercising her right to be present, but as someone to be questioned, monitored, and eventually confronted. The atmosphere thickened with subtle hostility. Nearby citizens sensed a tension, though no one spoke of it aloud. Crestwood had a long, unspoken history of racial imbalance within its policing culture. Publicly, reforms were celebrated. Internally, old habits lingered beneath polished policies. Amara's calm demeanor only intensified the officers' curiosity. They approached not with inquiry, but with presumption. Their steps were firm, their posture rigid, their expressions already shaped by conclusions they had not verified. To them, she was not an observer. She was an anomaly in a space they believed they controlled. Behind the uniforms and structured lines of authority, an invisible narrative was already forming. It was a narrative shaped by bias, reinforced by unchecked power, and dangerously close to becoming an incident that would ripple far beyond that courthouse plaza. Amara sensed a shift before. The confrontation escalated not through chaos, but through calculated assumptions. The officers tightened their formation as they approached Amara, their presence heavy with unspoken accusations. Their posture communicated enforcement before engagement, suspicion before verification. Bystanders noticed a shift, sensing the imbalance and attention directed toward a single individual who had done nothing to provoke intervention. Amara remained composed, her breathing steady, her posture neutral. She understood that reacting emotionally in such moments often fueled escalation rather than resolution. Her years in federal oversight had exposed her to countless cases where minor confrontations spiraled into institutional controversies simply because authority was exercised without restraint. The lead officer's demeanor carried a tone of superiority rooted in unchecked confidence. His actions reflected a mindset that authority alone justified aggression. The environment around them grew quieter, as if the plaza itself anticipated the tension about to unfold. Without proper inquiry, without procedural justification, the officers moved closer in a display meant to assert dominance rather than ensure safety. Their body language suggested that they had already decided how the situation would be interpreted. To them, control was not something to be negotiated through fairness, but enforced through intimidation. Amara's silence seemed to frustrate them. She did not challenge. She did not retreat. And she did not engage in confrontation. Instead, she observed, analyzing their conduct with precision of someone trained to document behavioral patterns under stress. Every gesture, every movement, every deviation from protocol registered in her mind as evidence of systemic issues she had long studied. The moment of injustice came suddenly, yet predictably. A gesture meant to force compliance crossed a boundary of professionalism and respect. The action was swift, public, and unjustified, witnessed by civilians and recorded by multiple phones. The slap was not merely physical. It was symbolic of a deeper issue within a culture that too often equated authority with the right to humiliate. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The air thickened with disbelief. For many, it was not the first time they had seen excessive force directed toward someone who looked like Amara, but this time felt different. Her composure, even in that moment of humiliation, carried a quiet strength that unsettled the officers more than resistance ever could. She did not retaliate. She did not argue. She did not expose her identity. Instead, she stepped back with controlled dignity, her eyes steady, her silence louder than any confrontation could have been. The courthouse plaza fell into a stunned silence as Amara stepped out of the vehicle in full uniform, her presence commanding immediate recognition. The polished insignia on her shoulders reflected years of service, discipline, and authority far beyond local jurisdiction. Cameras shifted toward her, capturing the moment with an intensity that transformed the atmosphere from routine enforcement to historic accountability. The officers' expressions changed almost instantly. Confidence dissolved into confusion, and confusion quickly turned into visible unease. Their earlier posture of dominance no longer aligned with the reality unfolding before them. The woman they had publicly humiliated now stood before them as a federal oversight commander with direct authority to investigate departmental misconduct. Her composure remained unwavering. She moved with calm precision, each step deliberate, each movement signaling control not through aggression, but through legitimacy. The crowd observed in silence, sensing the weight of the moment as the narrative of power shifted in real time. Internal affairs officials, already alerted by viral footage, arrived on site shortly after. Documentation requests were issued, body camera recordings were secured, and procedural reviews began immediately. The officers who had once relied on institutional protection found themselves subjected to the very scrutiny they had long avoided. The lead officer attempted to maintain composure, but the imbalance of authority was undeniable. His earlier confidence now appeared reckless under the lens of federal oversight. Every action, every deviation from protocol, and every unjustified use of force became part of formal investigation. Amara's presence alone dismantled the illusion of unchecked power. She did not need confrontation. She did not need raised voices. Her uniform, her credentials, and the documented evidence spoke louder than any argument. The system that had once shielded misconduct now faced exposure through undeniable proof. Media coverage intensified as, in the weeks that followed, Crestwood underwent a transformation few had anticipated. Policy revisions were implemented, mandatory bias training expanded, and independent oversight mechanisms strengthened. The incident that began with arrogance and prejudice evolved into a landmark case for institutional accountability. Amara continued her work with the same quiet determination that had defined her career. She declined public praise, redirecting attention toward broader systemic reform rather than personal recognition. Her perspective remained grounded in the understanding that true justice required structural change, not symbolic victories. The officers involved faced formal disciplinary actions, including termination and legal review of excessive force charges. Their actions, once shielded by departmental culture, became documented examples in training modules addressing misuse of authority and racial bias. Community trust, though shaken, began a slow process of rebuilding. Public forums allowed citizens to voice concerns openly, and new transparency policies ensured greater accountability in future enforcement operations. The courthouse plaza, once a site of humiliation, became a symbol of reform and reflection. For Amara, the experience reinforced a lifelong truth. Authority without empathy breeds injustice, while accountability anchored in integrity creates lasting change. Her calm response to public humiliation demonstrated that dignity, when paired with institutional power and strategic action, could dismantle even the most entrenched arrogance. National conversations about racial profiling in law